Much. Sir Stephen Thames.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. On the 10th of November, a week before the Chancellor stood up to make his statement, the Trussell Trust published their latest figures on the number of emergency food parcels that had been delivered over the first 6 months of this financial year. And their figures show that the number was 1.3 million in the first 6 months of the year, an increase of 1/3 over the previous year. And it looks as though there are going to be about 2.5 million over the course of this financial year as a whole, which will be an increase of more than 40-fold since the number of emergency food parcels handed out by the Chancellor Trust food banks in 2010-11, a 40-fold increase in that period. Now, why was the number so much more in this financial year than in the last financial year? Well, part of the reason, undoubtedly, is that there's been a big real terms cut in benefit levels this year. Universal credit was increased by 3.1% in April this year at a time when inflation was nearly 10%. And the consequence of that, according to the House of Commons Library, is that the headline rate of benefit is now at the lowest level in real terms for 40 years, since 1982-3. A real terms cut this year, of course, means significantly more people forced to go to food banks than in the previous year. I was very interested to hear the Right Honourable Member for Middlesbrough South say that he would not have increased benefits next year in line with inflation. I did ask the Chancellor in September what his intention about benefit uprating was, and he didn't answer, but I suspect that what the Right Honourable Gentleman has said, and he was a leading member of that administration, speaks for that government as a whole. It would probably not have been increased in line with inflation, and that would have meant several 100,000 more people going to food banks in the course of the coming year. And I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that our economy is failing so badly that so many people are unable to obtain, through their work and other efforts, the means to sustain the absolute basics of living for themselves and for their families? So I'm extremely relieved, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the Chancellor did announce that benefits will be uprated properly in line with the usual formula next April, so a 10.1% rise. That isn't going, I don't think, to significantly reduce the problem of people going to food banks, but at least it should ensure it's not going to get a great deal worse next year as it has done this year. And for that, I think we can be thankful. I'm also pleased that the benefit cap is going to be uprated. Now, the benefit cap was introduced in 2012, and we were told at the time that it was to constrain the total amount of benefit a household could receive in relation to median earnings. There was some sort of rationale given for the level that was set. But then it was frozen. There was no link at all with median earnings beyond the initial announcement until 2016, and that was the only time the benefit cap was changed, and it was reduced. It was significantly reduced to some other lower level whose significance was never explained to us, except that it was a lot less than the level at which the benefit cap had been introduced. And now, thankfully, the Chancellor is finally going to uprate it next year by 10% in line with inflation. But what I can't understand is, surely it should be uprated each year. I mean, if there is some rationale for the level at which it is set, it's presumably linked to inflation in some way, and we ought to know what that is, and then it should be raised each year, because at the moment, all this time that it's been frozen, all it means is each year more people crash into it and have to go to food banks in order to obtain the means to maintain their lives and the lives of their families. So I'm very relieved it is going to be uprated, finally, one-off, for next April. As I understand the statement published by the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, he has carried out a review of the level of the benefit cap, something he's required by law to do every 5 years. I very much hope he's going to publish that review so that we can see what the rationale is for the level at which the cap has been set, and get some idea of what the government's intentions are for the future for that level. So the Secretary of State will be coming to the Select Committee next week. We look forward very much to a discussion with him, and I hope he will be able to tell us that that review will be published. But as my honourable friend on the front bench rightly pointed out, the thing that hasn't been uprated is the local housing allowance. And it's worth just spending a moment, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the history of this, because the local housing allowance, which limits how much housing support can be provided, was initially set at 50% of median rent in each area. So the idea was that support would cover at least half of the homes available for rent in the area. And then in 2011, it was reduced to 30%. So it would only cover the cheapest 3 in 10 homes available to rent in the area. And then it was frozen for years. It wasn't increased at all. And so what happened was increasingly people had to dip into the rest of their benefit in order to pay their rent. The pressure on them became tighter and tighter until the beginning of the pandemic, when it was raised back up to the 30% level. And that was a very helpful move. But since then, it's been frozen again. We're being told it's frozen again next year, so that'll be 3 years in which it hasn't been raised at all, despite the fact, as my honourable friend rightly pointed out, rents are surging at the moment, and the only way people can pay the rent is by dipping into the other benefit they receive, which is supposed to meet their other living costs. I think the idea is that by keeping the local housing allowance down, the government will restrain the increase in rents. But I haven't seen any evidence at all that that's happening. It's just making things harder and harder for families. I agree with what the Chancellor said about inactivity. There is a big problem about a large number of people, and again my honourable friend on the front bench made this point, who've dropped out of the labour market since the pandemic. The former Prime Minister told us in the House 12 times between November 2021 and July this year that we had more people in employment than before the pandemic. That was not true. He knew it was untrue. And what the Chancellor said is correct. A lot of people have stopped working. We don't quite know what they're living on at the moment, whether they've dipped into their pensions early or what's happening. The Chancellor is right. That needs to be addressed. We need to find ways of giving incentives and encouragement to enable people to return to work. And again, we will look forward to discussing that with the Secretary of State at the Work and Pensions Select Committee meeting next Wednesday. But I want finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, to just come back to the points I made at the start. We do need, I think, can't we all agree, there must be a serious effort to reduce dependence on food banks. We cannot keep on, year after year, hundreds of thousands more people having to go to a food bank, including people who are working full-time in some cases, who are unable to obtain enough to sustain their life and the lives of their family members. Surely, where people are working a full week, that ought to be enough to sustain their costs. People who are unable to work through illness or disability, surely as well, our society ought to be able to support them sufficiently that they shouldn't have to go to a food bank to live. As the Trussell Trust itself points out, yes, I will give way. Yeah.
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes a very persuasive case about the need to make sure that work pays. Does he recognise, of course, that one of the most welcome measures in the Chancellor's Autumn Statement was the increase in the national living wage, which will now stand at well over £10 from next April?
Well, I'm glad it is being raised. It certainly needs to be, and I think it'll need to go further. But I think the Right Honourable Gentleman would probably agree with me that if you're working full-time on the level of that's legally, the minimum that's legally allowed, that ought to be enough to enable you to live and to support your family. At the moment it isn't, and my question is, why is that, and what are we going to do to put it right? Part of the answer must be having an adequate social security safety net. Yes. We don't have that at the moment, and we're going to need it in the future.
Thank you very much.